A year ago, someone suggested to Gary that he gets a piece of string set between the slit distances and that he marks notches all the way along the string and then does this with it, arcs it all the way around in a circle like that. And then he marks where the notches line up. Now, although Gary never shuts up about this piece of string trick, he's never actually done it, because if he had, he would realise it doesn't give the results he thinks it gives. For a year, he's been telling us that it gives evenly spaced fringes all around that circle, or all around that semicircle, but it doesn't. It creates an uneven spacing, the same as Walter Fender showed in his simulation about 20 years ago. And now Gary was laughing at that the other day about Walter Fender being wrong, but it's Gary who's been wrong. That's how we know that Gary hasn't actually done this string trick, even though he talks about it all the time. He hasn't actually done it, because if he had, he would know you get a different result than Gary thinks you get. Now, a more reliable way of doing it, obviously, is to use actual tape measures. So let's do it again. Okay, so the first notch that Gary says isn't the first notch, but I'm going to mark it. Let's just assume it is anyway. Let's not argue about that for now. I don't know if I can get the cameras coming any closer. There, I'm lining up that mark there on this ruler with the mark on that ruler. So they're lined up there exactly. I've got my glasses on so I can be as accurate as I can. I don't want to make any mistakes. And I'll do what the person suggested to Gary. I'll mark where all the notches line up, and that tells us where all the notches should be around that curved surface. Okay, that semicircle. You can see underneath, actually, I've already done it. You can see there, that's a bit of a giveaway, but I've done this many times. Gary's never done it, clearly, otherwise he would know what the results are going to be. Everybody else knows what the results are going to be. Anyway, so let me show you if it's the first time for you. Again, so I put a dot there where those two notches line up. So now we look for where they line up again a second time. Oh, it's there. Okay, the next notch. Can you see? I don't know whether let me try and get the camera a bit closer, because you need to see this. So you can see where I've lined those two notches up. Then you swing it around, you arc it around, and you mark where the next one lines up, okay? Put another dot there. Then you do the same again there. Oops. Line those two up. Now we carry on. Next notch. Remember, Gary thinks that these are evenly spaced. So that's how we know he's not done it, because so then this one, notches lined up. The next one. Okay, and again. And the next one. I have to tilt the camera up some more. You can see my problem here, because go back to that one. That one's fair enough. Then that one, that's okay. Yes. I'll tilt the camera up a bit so you get to see the next one. And there we go. So it never. Can you see that they never actually? It's looking to line up with that one, but it never does, just because of the spacing that we have. And if I went beyond 90 degrees, it would only start going back on itself. So that's the limit. Okay, so let me take the camera out a bit so you can get a more overall view now. You see we've got a mark there, there. I need to make them clearer for you. Okay, I'll make the marks clearer. Put a circle around them. And that one is kind of X. Most rational people can see that the spacings are not the same. They're getting wider and wider apart the further around we go. Let me measure as accurately as I can. I'll measure as accurately as I can. So this one is 43 millimeters. Okay, 43 millimeters. The next one is 44 millimeters. 44 millimeters. The next one is, I think, 45. I'm not sure if it's 45 or 46. Say 45 millimeters. The next one is, I'm sorry if I'm in the way of the camera, 49 millimeters there. 49. So it's growing exponentially, isn't it? And the next one is 52 millimeters. 52 millimeters. 59 millimeters. Yes. 59 millimeters. 74 millimeters. 74 or 75. And then the next one goes off the scale to the edge of the paper where I put the X. That's 123. 1, 2, 3, greater than. So folks, you can see that Gary has obviously never actually checked this, because otherwise he would know that these fringes get exponentially bigger. 43, 44, 45, 49, 52, 59, 74, over 123. So what Gary's been teaching us for a year is utter nonsense. Now, that's not a surprise to me, because there are so many other things that Gary has been teaching us utter nonsense about too. This is just one of many, many, many examples teaching us how loudspeakers work. It's just laughable. And you can take a loudspeaker apart, and you couldn't be bothered. Does that look like a steel rod to you? Just imagine if they made loudspeakers that way. It would be far too heavy. The mass would be too great for it to accelerate forward and backwards. And that's the other thing. He claims that they don't move forward and backwards under electromagnetism. He claims that they're pulled backwards due to electromagnetism, then released under the springiness of the springiness of the material that holds the cone in place. He says that alone, this elasticity, this elastic rubbery stuff, the suspension, which is actually there to dampen it just so it doesn't create too much noise of its own. He claims that that elasticity projects it forward about 800 miles an hour, faster than a typical jet. Faster than Mach 1, because he says that's fundamental to how sound is generated, that the cone has to go faster than the speed of sound to create sound. He's an idiot. I've made demonstrations where that you can see the cone moving forward at an even speed, nowhere near 800 miles an hour, and yet we can still detect that sound. Even if it's going at a faster speed, we still know it's not going at 800 miles an hour. And a tuning fork is a typical example. You can measure how far the tuning fork tines, I think they're called, how far they actually move for a given frequency, so you can do a definite calculation how fast they travel, and it works out to a fraction of a mile an hour. I did do the calculation recently for 440 hertz tuning fork. Even if you really hit it hard and you're generous with how far you expect the tines to vibrate, you can still hear the tuning fork even when it's dying out after it's been ringing for about 30 seconds. You can still hear it faintly. So quite clearly the tines aren't moving very far at all. So it's probably not even moving a few feet a second at that point. 440 cycles per second. That's the note A. You can clearly hear that, so it's clearly sound, and it's only moving these minute distances when the sound is fading out. And even at its loudest, it's moving a fraction of a millimeter. I know because I've measured it. I've had it filmed on screen and I've blown it up so I can measure how far they're moving and then do some simple calculations as to how much movement there is, how fast it's moving. And see, Gary is nowhere near right. I've gone off at a tangent talking about sound. That's my favourite subject. But Gary talks so much nonsense about that, and this is just the beginning of the nonsense he talks about sound and loudspeakers. He says there's little hairs on the surface of this cone. It's made of plastic. Why would there be hairs on the surface of it? And he says those hairs whip, like the tip of a bullwhip, because we all know that the tip of a bullwhip makes a cracking noise because that is breaking the sound barrier. But that's a pretty rare instance of something like that actually happening and causing a crack because you're breaking the sound barrier. That is a mini sonic boom. But Gary reckons that's happening now while I'm speaking. He reckons that the hairs in my nose and my throat, those little cilia that catch the dust particles that are there to protect our lungs from pollutants in the air. No, he reckons that's not what they're for. He reckons they're there to make sound. He's not kidding. This is how dumb the guy is. He's so dumb as he's been pontificating for a year about these all being the same, these all being the same width. And he was laughing the other day at Walter Fenn, the German scientist, professor, who has done some fantastic simulations. Gary was laughing at them, saying that they're wrong. And he was laughing at me, sarcastically saying how Steve says that this guy's work is brilliant. Well, it was brilliant because his demonstration, his simulation, showed that these get wider and wider. And Gary thought that was a mistake that Walter Fenn had made. No, that was Walter Fenn being accurate and Gary being a stupid moron, which Gary consistently is, I'm afraid. Anyway, I don't want to get too distracted because there are so many other things that Gary has got wrong. It's easier to point out the things that Gary has got right. It would take about 10 seconds. But let's save that, shall we? The reason Gary even focused on this is because I mentioned in passing in a comment that he couldn't resist making an entire video about it. or several videos about really. I mentioned in passing that Gary, moron that he is, when he does actually get something that's anywhere near right, such as talking about how we should by rights project the slit experiments on a curved screen to get a better result, Gary claims those ideas as his own when they're clearly never are his own. They're always someone else's work. So I mentioned Professor Walter Fenn's simulations, what brilliant work he used to do and probably still does, that we should all be grateful for. And Gary used that as an excuse to make a video and mock Walter Fenn for making mistakes, which Walter Fenn hadn't made. It was Gary who'd made the mistakes. And he was trying to mock me and laugh at me because I had supported someone, said Walter Fenn's work is brilliant. So Gary was laughing at me saying, you were saying his work's brilliant and he's made a mistake. He's got them all the wrong distances. And he hasn't. His work was correct. It was Gary who was wrong. So stick that in your pipe and smoke it, Gary. When Gary does get something anywhere near right, it's very unlikely to ever have been his own work. And that's why he has to get on the defensive. What kind of a person goes around stealing other people's work and trying to pass it off as his own? What kind of character does that? A nasty person like Gary. Anyway, that'll do for the moment, so I've pointed that out. Now, there's another claim he keeps making as well now. I'll end this video here for the moment. Actually, the next claim that Gary makes, I can probably carry on with this diagram, extend it further outwards and carry on showing something else that Gary's got wrong. Gary's made a big deal about when these are pointing inwards from the width of the slit, this first constructive interference point here. He says that isn't a guaranteed constructive interference point because you should start up there and work your way around, and these might work out that they are not an interference point. They could be a destructive interference point or anywhere between the two. He says at this point where these are pointing inwards, that's a tiny millimeter or sub-millimeter distance, and it is, because that is a sub-millimeter distance typically. But he says that's fundamentally different to when they're pointing outwards. So here they're no longer pointing inwards. So he says this is fundamentally different from here on. And yet we can mark, let me try and now mark the minima. I will first of all mark some more maxima going the other way, doing the same notching up lining business as we just did. Put a notch there, there. We do another one there, and another one there, and there. Can you see okay? There, and there. Well, that'll have to do for now. So let me make those clear again. Circle, circle. Now using a green pen, I will mark the halfway points, but I'll have to... Exactly halfway between the notches lining up is where the destructive interference should be. So let's mark those. I think we can guess, can't we, that they're going to be... You don't need to be a genius to work out that they'll be halfway. I'm not going to do them all. Oh, no, why not? Let's carry on. Let's not be lazy. Not do a Gary. Right, so I'll just put a line for all the destructive interference. So you can see where there's a line, that's destructive interference. So that's our central maxima. I'm going to put CM, just to remind us that's our central maxima. Now, a point worth mentioning is that really this is a load of old nonsense anyway, because in reality, nobody ever sees the fringes going beyond about those points there. That's pretty much all you ever see, that between my hands there. A very narrow range. There's nothing to see around here in reality. I've never seen it, and I've been doing this for about 3 or 4 years now. Gary's been pretending to do it for about 10 or 11 years, and he's never seen it. He just pretends it's there. I think everybody pretends it's there. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It's hard to say because nobody ever sees it. So we are actually talking about fringes that no one ever actually sees because they're so far out and so weak, so feeble, that it's arguable whether we actually do have any at those angles. Gary's pretending that he knows for a fact that we do. But Gary doesn't know any such thing. So I've already pointed out that Gary knows very little at all. Everything Gary pretends he knows, not just that, pretense. It's guesswork. Yes, that science is all about guesswork, but testing your guesses, that's the one thing Gary never, ever does. Gary guesses and then from then on claims those things as fact. Unless he has a better idea or what he thinks is a better idea, and then he starts saying, well, I forget what I told you last week. Actually, he doesn't do that even. He doesn't even have the integrity to do that. He doesn't say, forget what I told you last week. He just carries on as if you've been watching every single episode of his fucking shit show. And so you've been keeping up with it as if it's important enough to follow. It's not. You should just shut the fuck up and wait until he's finished his theory and then publish it, instead of giving you a daily update. Year in, year out, boring the crap out of all of us, forcing us to keep changing what our understanding of his crapola. It's just silly. I only follow him for a giggle, and I think 90% of people only follow him for a giggle, because it is funny. It's fucking hilarious sometimes, it really is. Anyway, that'll do for the moment, but I think you can see that he's talking shit when he says that there's something special about that when the central maxima from when they point in, it doesn't make any sense at all. He's just talking out of his arse. It's a lovely continuum of the pattern, isn't it? There's nothing bad about that. Thank you for listening.